Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Sounding Black podcast with Till and Will. Want to quickly talk about what we discussed last week, which was we discussed emasculation of the black man. And of course, that was a heavy topic because we dug into a tweet, or actually it was a Facebook post, and we discussed that. And we want to continue that conversation, sort of expound on that a little bit. But there's going to be a few topics, I think, that sort of carry that same tone in terms of having that conversation about emasculation and also just about black men, black people in general. And so with that, I want to kick it over to AD really quick, to Will, I should say, really quick. And let's talk about what we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, as far as the discussion today, obviously we have the what the people want, and we'll get into that shortly. And then we'll kind of go into the emasculation of the black male briefly, as you had already mentioned, and then really go into this tweet that it seemed to be an appreciation of black men, and we're going to unpack that because there's a lot to be said about that tweet.
Absolutely.
So before we get any further into that, just kind of want to go back to what the people want. For anybody who's been alive the last 2 days, they know there was another mass shooting or a terrorist attack, if you will, in New Zealand, where, as far as I know, about 50, I think they said 50 Muslim children, men, women, were killed in the middle of or during prayer ceremonies. I think it was during prayer, I'm not sure.
From what I remember, I think that's correct.
Yeah. And I think it's just kind of important for us to touch on that, mainly because of some of the responses that we've been seeing online. In one instance, you see a tragedy like this and you question like the direction of humanity. But then you start seeing some of the responses and you say, okay, you know what, we might be okay. Yeah. I'm not sure if you saw, but there were a lot of people posting and tweeting about the responses, not just over there, but even here in the U.S. There was an individual who went into a mosque, a non-Muslim individual who went into a mosque with roses for the members of that mosque. There was a large group of Jewish people who kind of paved the way, or they were there to greet Muslims who were going into the mosque. Right. There was, I think, police security for another mosque. So it's just like a lot of positive responses. So that did make me feel like there's a chance that we might eventually get to a place where there can be an overall, or I guess a renewed hope in humanity. But then there were also some responses saying, well, 120 Christians got killed by Afghanistan. So where's the press on that? And then there was the commentary by President, number 45 or whatever you want to call him. Some of his commentary and a comparison between his response to this incident versus the New Zealand's leader's response to this incident. So just kind of wanted to touch on that a bit because it's definitely something that's been trending a lot. What are your thoughts?
On a lighter note, let me point out that, have you seen this video of this kid? There's a senator in Australia who happened to say something about immigration, and his kid just eggs him in the back of the head. Yeah. Like that part. Oh my God, that was hilarious to me. So
I saw it, and it was funny up until that politician threw that right cross,
right,
and knocked the poor kid down. I was just like, oh my God, this got bad real quick.
But kudos to that kid for being bold enough to egg that senator. I'm sorry I cut you off, but
no, I appreciate it. We needed some lightheartedness for a moment, but no, I mean that's really my moment. I just wanted to kind of touch on that because I think it was definitely something that was important, and I think that the responses to it were probably the most important, just simply because it does show that we are people who can all have our differences and come together. Now, the question is, can we, much like we do in the black community, can we get to a point where people can come together without tragedy.
Yeah.
Because this is,
absolutely,
you see this on every scale. You know, for the country, it requires a tragedy for us to come together. For the Black community, sometimes it requires a tragedy for us to come together. In certain families, it requires somebody to pass away for you to come together. And I just think people need to take advantage of the time they have on this planet.
Yes, sir.
So, anyway, I'm off my soapbox, man. If you want to say something,
hey, man, no, I agree with all of that, and I think it's important that we sort of have that conversation, because oftentimes without tragedy, we aren't synergistic in that sense. We don't come together, and we don't sort of take the opportunity to take advantage of us all being here. Yeah. So I think it's important that we do sort of have those conversations and be able to talk about that kind of stuff. And with that said, I think it's an appropriate time to sort of talk about this tweet that was sort of a black male appreciation tweet.
Yeah. Do we have that tweet?
I have it up right now.
Okay.
And coming on the back end of what we talked about in terms of emasculation, I think this will allow us to have an even deeper conversation about what we talked about last week. So for those who haven't seen the tweet, it goes a little bit like this. Black men are not mixed baby factories. Black men are not for fetish, trend to follow, or someone you date to spite your family. Black men are beautiful beings to be loved, uplifted, and respected. If you aren't black and don't agree with this, you have no business dating black men. Period. Now
that's that final
period.
Pounding the table.
Right.
All right.
Now there's a lot that I want to say about this tweet, and there's a lot that I'm going to reveal even further down the line, but I wanted to begin the conversation by asking, what are your thoughts on this particular tweet?
I don't know that we can get into all of my thoughts on that tweet just in one show, but I can tell you when I first saw it, I was like, okay, I appreciated it initially, and then it just kind of made me start thinking about all of these things. It makes you think about everything from black male responsibility, interracial dating, the number of mixed babies I've seen running around, oftentimes with a non-black parent, just like you're wondering what happened. The amount of times I've heard people talk about how cute mixed children are, not really taking into consideration everything that's required to make that a healthy situation.
Right.
I thought about a friend of mine who I remember was dating. I think he was in law school and he was dating this girl, a Persian girl, and they had some relationship that reached the point where I think I don't know how much he cared about her, but I think he cared about her. But she ended up getting pregnant and aborting the child because there was no way that they could be together, which made me think back to, well, then why? Why are you guys even putting yourselves in that situation?
Right. Right.
So it just kind of brought up all of these thoughts. And yeah, man, we'll get into a lot of those, if not this episode, but next. But it was a lot to think about, for sure.
Yeah, and I had my own thoughts about this tweet, and then obviously we had a brief conversation with my wife about it, and that sort of led to some other thoughts. And so the interesting thing, after all of this conversation that we had about this tweet, one of the things that I thought about as a result of that was, do black men actually feel this way? So do black men actually feel that they're not mixed baby factories? Do black men actually feel like they're not for fetish? Do black men feel like they're not a trend to follow? And coming up with all of these questions on the backside of this, I had to really sit back and think. There is a ton of black men who enjoy being a mixed baby factory. I remember, a few months back, there was, I can't remember who this guy was or what he did, but I believe he was an athlete. a second-tier athlete, clearly, because I don't remember who he is.
You don't remember.
But he was celebrating this idea that they would be able to have more mixed babies, not only with his counterpart, but with his significant other, but with all the other black males that were around in this particular situation.
So okay.
So, I started to think about this, and, of course, we're going to dig a little bit further into this tweet. And it just made me think to myself that, are black men really representing everything that this tweet says in totality? Because obviously there's going to be individuals like who are exactly this, and they believe this, like black men are and aren't the things outlined in this tweet. So I want to hear what you think about, all of that.
Man, it's funny when you said that, because when I looked at the tweet, like, I see it as a message to women, non-black women,
right,
who have an interest in black men, just saying, like, if you're going to do this, let it not be under this set of circumstances. Right. That's initially how I looked at it. But looking or listening to you a little bit further, it never really dawned on me that black men were not only promoting this stuff, but embracing it.
Right.
See, I was looking at it more from if that's the case, that maybe from an ignorant standpoint, like, they don't know that they're being used for these things. They don't know that they're being used to piss dad off, or to piss mom off, or to, just make mixed babies or whatever it is. But now you got me sitting here second guessing and thinking that maybe like there are people who actually recognize this, black men that recognize this and fully embrace it.
Yep.
And that kind of ignorance is no way I can condone that at all, because that's just detrimental to everybody involved, including those kids, especially those kids.
So to me, this tweet comes from somewhere.
Right.
Like, the origin of this tweet, whether it be from the feelings of the women who are dating these men, or the men who are promoting this type of thought process.
Right.
It's coming from either one of those sides, and potentially even another side. So it's something that we have to approach with the idea that this is the logic that some people use to approach these situations and come into relationships like this.
I mean, it's interesting because I think historically we know that mixed babies have been, like, they've always been in play from plantation to present, for a variety of reasons.
You can look at me and see that clearly.
You can look at me and see it.
Yeah, right.
Well, actually, not
sure.
really. But you can
less so.
You can look at my 23andMe and see that 20% that I don't discuss much.
Yeah, right.
Of Irish British mix. But no, I mean, the point is, like, this idea about mixed babies, that's always been there. I think the interesting thing, and this is probably a whole nother show, is how quote unquote cute mixed babies are, and that comes from everybody. Right. That comes from non-blacks and blacks alike. Right. And from the non-black standpoint, I can't speak on that. I don't know. From the black standpoint, part of it is, the babies are cute. Part of it is colorism. Part of it is self-hatred. Like, there's like so many things on our end to kind of deal with when we talk about that. I don't know what the perspective is on the other end. I'd be interested to hear what it is. But I mean, that one probably stood out to me more than maybe the fetish and the pissing people pissing families off. That's my take on it.
So to dig a little bit deeper into this tweet, so I think this is going to direct this conversation in an entirely different way. When I first looked at this tweet,
wait, before you get into that, can you talk about the popularity of this tweet, just so we? This is not a scenario where it's just like, this is just something we came across. Like, if it exploded, and it wasn't like from somebody that had like a huge following. This is just, which tells you how big this message was. it was somewhere, over 50,000+, maybe more.
And that was when we sort of looked at it at a random particular time. I think it had taken off even more since then. Yeah. So I think it was like 58,000, likes and 20,000 something odd retweets. So I'm sure it's gained even more since then.
Right.
And then I'm trying to go to this young lady's page right now to see if we could, find out exactly where it is right now. But either way, it gained a lot more popularity than what you'd see typically from if there was somebody who... Okay, I think it makes more sense to tell more details about the author of this tweet in order for us to have the conversation and for me to say what I was just getting ready to say. So the young lady who tweeted this is not a black woman.
Dun, dun, dun.
She's not a black woman. And her Twitter name just happens to be Mixed Stardust. And so I thought it was a little ironic that a non-black woman will be tweeting something like this. Mm-hmm. And to be quite honest, I took issue with the fact that at the end of this tweet, it says, if you aren't black and don't agree with this, you have no business dating black men. So in my mind,
I wish they could see the quizzical look on your face.
In my mind, I'm going, how exactly are you tweeting this and you aren't a black woman and you're speaking from a black woman's perspective? That part I don't understand. And so, when I look at the details of this tweet, look at your Twitter name, it's to me saying you feel like it's your place even when it shouldn't be, when you're saying basically I'm a mixed person myself, right, just based on your Twitter name. I don't know who this young lady is, so it's kind of like someone tweeting about mass incarceration and they're the warden of a jail, and in my mind a warden of a prison. Those two things just didn't go together when I sat and looked at that tweet.
And that I think is that's interesting, because I think we've both gone back and tried to look at some of the responses, and I know it just got like a ton of mixed reviews. Mm-hmm. A lot of black males. No pun intended. Good one. A lot of black males, rightfully so. I don't know if rightfully so is the way I want to say it. You know what? I don't know what the term is, but essentially, a lot of black males liked it. Actually, rightfully so isn't the term I'm looking for, but I would say naturally.
Yeah.
Liked it because, something that they agreed with, I'm assuming. There were black women who liked it, but then there were black women who had also said, we've been saying this for years,
right,
and no traction. Like, now she says it, and suddenly it's this popular. And that's a whole nother discussion, but this idea that is the message fine up until we find out who the author is, and that to me is a real issue here, because on one hand, do we have any disagreement with what the woman said? I mean, me personally, I don't have any disagreement with what she said. I agree with the tweet by itself. Now we factor in the author. And how much does that change it? And you said something that I wanted to kind of go back on when you said that she was tweeting something that was that should have been from a black woman's perspective.
Right.
And I wanted to kind of ask you a bit more about that, because in one sense, if black males are underappreciated, right, is it only black women who can appreciate them, or can the world appreciate them? And does it have to be women that appreciate them? Or even, can it be men that appreciate them? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So here's my thing. When I looked at that tweet, as you pointed out, my initial assumption was that the person tweeting this was a black person.
Okay.
So, of course, as I dug deeper and I noticed that she wasn't black herself, it just, in my mind, triggered this response. How can you say, if you aren't black and don't agree with this, you have no business dating black men and you aren't black yourself? So from my perspective, that is the reason I looked at it as, if you're saying if you aren't black and you aren't black,
gotcha.
How are you tying those two things together?
So it's almost like this person is laying down a criteria that has to be fulfilled if you are going to date black men.
Right.
That's the real snag in this.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that. I don't think I initially looked. Oh, shit. I don't know how this is coming out because I backed away from the mic. but all right. I didn't look at it from that standpoint initially, but kind of unpacking it with you, I can see that. I can definitely see how that creates an issue because your analogy before makes even more sense when looking at it from that standpoint.
Yeah.
So I mean that in and of itself is something that I wish we can actually just talk to, because I'm curious to find out what made her wake up that morning and say, let me say this.
Right.
Because like for me to say something like that, it would have been in response to something. Like if, for instance, in response to last week's episode, like which essentially tore down black men. There was some truth in it, but it tore down black men. A response to that to me would have been a tweet or a message or a post like this.
Right.
I don't even know that she saw, heard, or knew of that. So what made her wake up that day and say, I'm gonna post something.
Right.
Now, there are some theories by people online, one of them being that she was, and I'm let me know if I butcher this because this is one of your millennial terms. Okay, that she was chasing clout or clout chasing. What do you guys call it?
She was clout chasing.
Clout chase. All right. Explain what the hell is that, man? Let's go there. Bring me into your world for a moment. What the hell is clout chasing?
Let me break it down in order for Gen X to understand. So somebody who is chasing clout, I would want to come up with terminology that you would understand, but it's difficult because Gen X, they were doing the chicken and doing what
chicken. Good Lord, I'm not that old.
I'm totally joking with you. But somebody who's chasing clout, they're looking for that validation from other people. Mm-hmm. They're looking to sort of get this approval from, in this case, black men in order to sort of sneak in their own way to feel appreciated. Mm-hmm. So in these terms, the clout chasing is, okay, let me tweet an appreciation for black men so black men can notice me. Mm. And I can get that validation that, I'm standing with black men and I can be appreciated in my own right. So that's the way we should look at it in this particular situation. Okay. So
let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Would it matter if this person dated or did not date black men? Like if let's say if this person dated black men, does that make this more clout chasing? And if this person did not date black men, does it make it less clout chasing? You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Or is it the same no matter?
Personally, I think it's the same no matter what. Okay. And the reason for that is there's always going to be some sort of, in my mind, some sort of tie-in that brings those two together.
I can see that. Yeah, because I think that, and a lot of people did kind of comment on that aspect of it, and I think it's hard. And obviously we don't know her preferences. To me, it would make. I don't think it would change whether you could think it was clout chasing, but I think if she did date black guys, it would 100% make it seem more like clout chasing because it's a particular audience.
It would solidify the rebuttals.
Right, 100%. So, man, I know we said there was a lot to unpack, and I don't even think we came close to finishing it.
Right, I mean, because we could definitely keep going on about it. Continue.
Before we leave it, though, because we will have to come back to the author aspect of it, but there were other comments about, well, what about black women? Like, in other words, like you're laying out this appreciation for black men. What about black women? And that's, go ahead.
I'm about to say that speaks to that clout chasing aspect of it and why people responded in that way. Right. So you, a non-black woman, are tweeting in appreciation of black men, but you're not showing a similar appreciation to black women. So what would lead you to tweet something like this in appreciation of black men if you weren't clout chasing or if you weren't seeking that validation from black men?
Right.
And what are your feelings toward black women?
Right.
Why did, you know?
Why not include them in the? And I look back at some of the responses, and I did see some people who asked that question, and then she included them, but I don't know if it is satisfying because it's on the back end.
Right.
Because even though it may be an inclusion later, it clearly wasn't the motive or the interest.
It wasn't important enough for her to tweet about it.
It wasn't about black people.
Right.
It was about black men.
Exactly.
Now that also begs another question: is it because? And granted, we're just posing all these hypothetical, like speculative questions because we don't know her. But if there's always kind of this question mark about the black man being endangered. You've seen that. Well, that's more my era. Right. Like, there's an endangered species of black male, underappreciated, which we kind of already touched on. And it kind of creates this division about who is. I don't want to use the word more important because it's not really that question, but it's like who needs the most attention, right? Black men or black women. And is it possible to serve an agenda without even creating that separation?
Yep.
Can it just be black appreciation without appreciation for black men? And then what about black women?
Yep.
Can it be a question about, we're handling a particular issue as it relates to black people versus black men, deal with this, black women deal with that? I don't know.
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
No, honestly, I think that sort of allows us to transition to that article that we spoke about earlier, talking about intersectionality and the tragedy of the black male.
Yeah.
And so for those who haven't read this article, it was published in Psychology Today, September of 2018, actually, and it talks about feminism and how it ignores male issues as it especially has harmed the black community.
Right.
So to read a little bit about it, it says intersectionality is a concept often used in critical theories to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions, whether it be racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, classism, etc., are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. Intersectionality is a well-known word among people concerned about those who are marginalized. The term was coined by black feminist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. So, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's interesting that you say that, and we'll get into that more, but I think we had brought up this guy before, this Dr. Umar Johnson. Mm-hmm. He says a lot of stuff. Right. A lot that I don't agree with, some things I do agree with, but he says a lot of stuff. Right. And it's interesting because he almost echoed the same thing that this author said, in the sense that he felt as though, and I hope I'm not misquoting him, or my paraphrasing of his position isn't incorrect, but ultimately from what I recall, he was saying that the feminist movement and the LGBTQ movement were detrimental to the black movement. Mm-hmm. And it's that same concept in terms of what this article kind of touches on. So I just kind of wanted to point that out for those who don't know.
And then there's that intersectionality. Right. Because what if you're a black feminist?
Right. There you go. Or a black LGBTQ.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's the interesting part of the article is this author basically laying out that those agendas and the things that each of these people need, each of these groups need, they don't always coexist. Right, and you can kind of see that in times when things arise. So I think it's an interesting read for anyone who has never come across this article. Yep. I think we can probably post a link on our page for somebody to read because I think it's a must read for people. But yeah,
and to me, this article also speaks to the point that there's always a bunch of people outside of the black community speaking for black men, as we can see that's evidence in the tweet
Right.
and in this article that are
you just
non-black.
revealed it, huh?
Well, yeah, true. I did. But, you know, to that point, it also lays out, like, the facts are these.
I was going to ask you, please read that statement. Yes.
Black males are doing much worse than black females, especially among young people. Consider one extreme example: the fatal shootings of unarmed African Americans by police officers, which led directly to the Black Lives Matter movement. While this movement could not be called Black Male Lives Matter, because that would imply that black female lives don't, the fact is that the overwhelming majority of victims of these shooting deaths are male. Mm-hmm. And consider two main indicators of whether or not one is succeeding in life. On the negative side is incarceration, on the positive, educational achievement. And it dives a little bit deeper further down into the ratio between the incarceration of black males in the ratio to black females, and also education in terms of black females to black males.
Right, and how that's basically flip-flopped in recent years, where before it used to be like a 2-to-1 ratio
right.
of black males and receiving doctorate degrees
right.
to one female, and it's now the other way around, which
right.
is similar what you talked about before in last week's episode, in terms of, was it last week, in terms of black women being more educated?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about it then.
Yeah. So I mean, he brings these things up, and it's interesting because when you lay it out that way, it almost brings it in and makes you say, oh man, you know. And there's some truth to these things.
Right.
But then we read some of the responses. I think it was in Reddit, where they criticized the article because it basically did not touch on white supremacy and how that is just as impactful, if not more,
right.
than these issues that were being brought up. So to me, I don't even know what to do with all this information, because it's like many times when we try to solve an issue in the black community, you have all of these various contributing factors, external factors, I'll call them, you know. But then we also have on the flip side these internal factors, and it seems as though the focus is always on one or the other, rather than this holistic approach that addresses all of those things.
Right.
So,
and it seemed to me that in this Psychology Today article that the author was pinning the blame on feminism for black males not advancing in all of these areas.
Right.
So it's one of those things where it's like he's saying that the two cannot be tied together in order for black men to advance. And so you're saying, to your point earlier, do we take the cause of black men and decide to push them forward in a way where we could come together and sort of create this synergy in terms of allowing this to be the issue that we focus on, and ignore black women who have already been marginalized and ignored in so many different ways? And the interesting part of that is black women seem to be the main ones who are pushing for black men to be at the forefront of that thought process, and at the forefront of all of the issues that we take on, and carry that burden for the community to say Black Lives Matter. Because for those who don't know, the Black Lives Matter movement was started by black women.
Well, not just black women, black lesbian women.
Exactly.
So that intersectionality is there.
It all ties together. And so the interesting thing was, and I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, is in this situation, what are black men doing for, the other groups? And what responsibility do we have as black men to sort of bridge that gap in between, what black women are doing and what black men are doing?
See, here's the interesting thing to me when we talk about intersectionality, and the reason I think that the feeling is that it takes away from the black male. And I'm not saying I'm agreeing with this. I'm going to lay out why I think people think this, right? Because when you see people fighting for certain rights, you will see LGBTQ people fighting for black rights, which include black males. You'll see women fighting for black rights. And Again, that includes black males. But how often do you see black males fighting for the equal rights of women?
Mm-hmm.
How often do you see black straight males fighting for the rights of the LGBTQ community?
Right.
So part of it, to me, just seems to be that everything that is within the black community is kind of separated from black males, partially because of our lack of involvement in these other movements that don't, I wouldn't say they don't impact us, but we're not a member of.
Right.
Right. So it's like, I'm not gay, so why am I supporting that cause? Right. I'm not a woman, why am I supporting that cause? We're supporting that cause because just like, others who support causes that don't involve them, because you want to do something that's right. Right. But the other side of that is, these other individuals are supporting these black male movements, not necessarily because it's a male, but because they're black.
Yep.
And see, they have that commonality. So I don't know if it's the commonality of being black that creates the intersectionalism, or is it the other, the other aspects. So that's just something to think about too.
Yeah, and I always think about it in terms of change doesn't happen until the people who are not oppressed are in the battle in the same way that people who are oppressed. So, for instance, it's difficult to think about civil rights in terms of like how everything was laid out. And I think it speaks to the way our society operates. Mm-hmm. So things don't really hit until, not necessarily that it's cool, but somebody else decides to pick up the sticks and say, hey, this is my issue too, even though I'm not directly impacted by it.
Right.
An example of that is this tweet that we talked about earlier.
Right.
Black women have been saying that forever. Mm-hmm. And when a non-black woman tweets it, everybody, it blows up. It blows up.
Yeah.
So with civil rights and even, women's suffrage, for example, whether black women were speaking about it or not, whether black men were speaking about it or not, you can't really get the traction that you want, at least in this society, until other people take up that cause when it doesn't directly impact them, simply based on the fact that there's not enough of us for it to be an issue worth discussing or an issue worth taking up.
Yeah.
So we have to think about it in those terms, simply based on the fact that we can, speak about these things all we want to, but we also need partners to recognize that there is an issue. And it sucks that regardless of how much we speak about it, how much we say these things are happening, how much video evidence that we have to show that these things are happening, that it doesn't matter until somebody else says something.
Well, and man, you said a lot there, but that's the hardest part, right?
Absolutely.
And that's the thing. Is like, if we close everybody out that's not black, do we go unheard and do things go unchanged? Mm-hmm. And then if we open the doors and everybody is fighting for the same issue, are we able to do that without being concerned with not only their agenda, but also whether they are knowledgeable enough about what we're dealing with to be able to create that change?
Right.
And that's all. I mean, if you go back in history, that's always been an issue. Absolutely. With throughout the civil rights movement or even abolitionists. It's always been a concern. But I will say, similar to what you said, like all of those changes came about through the collective approach. Yep. It's impossible, in my mind, to do it without, from an external standpoint. Internally, that's different.
Right.
That's the one thing that you don't need anybody else to be involved with. Some of the things that the author was saying in that article were things that we do have some control over. Mm-hmm. Even if it's a more difficult road, that difficult road is not it's not a barrier. It's a hurdle. And hurdles you can get over, it just requires effort. Barriers, you can't do anything. You're stuck.
Right.
And that's a mindset issue. That's the reason, like, we've all been taught that you have to, how good you have to be. Right. So those are separate. But one of the things that you said that kind of made me think about this idea of change, like I feel like change is going to be very difficult to overcome or to reach, because like in my mind, when I think of equality, it requires inequality, to achieve it. And that's the part that no one is comfortable with. Yeah. Like if I take two kids, right, and I have a bag of candy, and I give to one kid, a handful of candy, like 5-6 pieces. That kid is content with those 5 or 6 pieces at the moment. Now, when I give the next kid 20 or 30 pieces, the next kid is really content with what he has. While now the other kid is realizing that what he has isn't good enough. Right. Because it's not equal. The only way I make it equal is I have to take from the other child. And that's the part that now, in his mind, it seems like it's unequal. Right. Because it's like, well, wait a minute, I'm losing so that you can get what I get. He's not focused on the fact that it's uneven and I want to balance it out. All he or she knows is that I'm losing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a lot of the fear in this country comes from, because the equality that we're all looking for means that there's going to have to be a period of inequality for the people in the power structure, which ultimately ends up being white males primarily. And that's going to be met with so much resistance. I just don't know how or when we get there. I believe it happens eventually, but it's always going to create this backlash, because you can't get there without creating that inequality, at least for the time being, to reach that equal point.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, to make 2 points there, is in their mind, they're saying, I have to give up power and control for you to reach my level in that sense. And to speak on what you talked about, there has to be inequality in order for us to get to that place. Well, inequality already exists on the side of the people who are marginalized. Inequality existed 300 years ago, 400 years ago, when white people came over here and decided, you know what, I'm done with these indentured servants. I need somebody who I could have enslaved for a lifetime. Right. And as a result of that, through hundreds of years, that inequality grew even further. And I was actually reading an article, and as you guys can tell, like, we read a lot in order to bring conversation to these podcasts. Is I was reading an article, and it talked about, even today, if a situation exists where somebody's on a level playing field, and it's a white male and black male, black female, and they both go to college, because of all the other things that the white male has advantages in, in order to get to that place, because of their connections, because of the wealth that their family has built on the backs of slaves, because obviously we built this country for free, on those connections and the wealth that their family structure has alone, I think the numbers, and I could be wrong in terms of the exact number, but it showed that, the wealth that the white family was able to build for their individual black and white male, they were $250,000, and then the black women or black men who even had the same level or even above education, they were still $170,000 behind that.
Yeah, I don't remember I read that article too. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I knew it was a huge disparity. Right. And for those who did not read the article, it was essentially, from my understanding, is everything that it takes to get to that point. The fact that a lot of the blacks are at least at that point, are the first to reach that level of education. The fact that in order to get that education, rather than have someone pay for their college or set up a college fund for them or anything like that, they're taking out loans. Right. They're having to pay back these loans. They're also having to take care of mom, take care of siblings, take care of other family members, pay someone else's, whatever it might be. It's all economic based, which stems from the original sin. but it's all economic based, but they're showing how you have all of this stuff taking place that creates this disparity. So that's, I mean, it's very similar to what you're saying like that, but that's the point that I'm making. In order to create the equality aspect, it's going to require inequality now, right?
Yep.
And that's the part that makes people uncomfortable, because if I sit back, like for instance, a lot of the Democratic nominees are talking about reparations, and they're talking about them in the standpoint of, actually, I don't know exactly how they're talking about them. I don't think they're talking about handing out checks to people who are black, but I think they're talking about acknowledging the fact that a harm was done, and there's an impact from that harm, and that we need to address it and address it financially, right? If you were to sit back and say, black male student, black female student, we're going to pay for your college for free because we know X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. What happens is that's an attempt to make things equal. But all this guy knows, are we going to bring Johnny back? Or John back? All John knows is that, well, wait a minute. My parents have to pay for my school. Mm-hmm. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. How is that fair? That's not equal. Yep. And that creates a further divide, because now this black person who's made it to the same level, it's because they had help. Right. Not realizing that everybody that gets to this point had help. Yeah. And that inequality, I think, creates that division that makes us like, okay, well, we reached the same point and everything's seemingly equal now, but the relationship is going to be more fractured than it was. So that's why I say, like, you know. Funny
enough, we could talk about the college scandal in that situation.
Right?
Because you got people who are basically paying other people to write college letters and...
Oh, it's not just college. College letters are nothing.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's even further than that, because you're building even further connections based on work that you did not do, but you're also pointing the finger and saying, oh, you got in because you're black. Right. And something we posted the other day, this was another tweet. You're going to see a lot of people of color saying this today, but let me just add my voice to the chorus. White classmates in high school told me to my face that I would get into college just for being black. And then a response to that tweet, one of my teachers held a class discussion about why I got into Northwestern, and some of my white classmates didn't. They decided it was because I was black. Never mind that I had a 3.8 GPA and took all honors AP, crushed the SAT, and that teacher told those kids I stole their spot. So,
wow. And that's at Northwestern, too, a top institution that is supposed to be more, wow, okay.
So, I mean, the thing is, regardless of how you successfully do that, there's always going to be people who say, oh, you got in because you're black.
Right.
And connecting back to what we were talking about earlier, when you talk about affirmative action, people will say, oh, you got the job because you're black. Right. Not recognizing that the people who are truly benefiting from affirmative action, or who have historically truly benefited from affirmative action, are white women.
Yeah.
And so then you have a deeper conversation about this idea of feminism. Right. So there's so many things and so many conversations that we could have as a result of this. And there's so much to dissect. There's so much to review. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is what you were saying earlier. And the question that we have to ask is, like, what issues are important, and who is truly being marginalized, who is truly being ignored, and how do we handle that?
Right. I thought you were going to say the true takeaway from this is that we have to do more episodes.
Which is definitely part of that.
But no, I agree with you, man. And that's going to be a question I think is going to be up for debate in future episodes. And I think, you know, even to kind of piggyback on that question, another question that can be posed is, do we have to? Like, do we have to decide who is more marginalized and who needs more attention? Can these things be addressed simultaneously? Yeah. Because there are going to be some, like if you look at that article, it makes the future of the black families seem grim. He doesn't say that, but the statistics make it sound that way. Yep. Because if you're telling me that a large percentage of black men compared to black women and compared to people, period, are in prison, you tell me that that there's a 2-to-1 ratio in black women in not higher education, but in doctorate degrees than black men, and I would suspect that gap's going to grow further, right? unless there's something changes. If you're telling me all of those things, every black family requires a black, mom and a black dad, and there's going to be some inequality in that family in terms of earning potential, and everything else. Then you still have that other aspect of whether these what these black women, what they have to choose from,
Yep.
In that scenario, and the response to being in a position where they're at 2-to-1 in a doctorate program. And then the idea of the creation of this family and what you're going to do when you have a little, child, a black child or black, the black child, period. Where do you go with that?
Yep.
So I think that it's a difficult thing to address, but if you're telling me that these problems persist, not in the black community primarily, but amongst black males, then it kind of suggests that the focus needs to be on them.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like doing a triage, and it's just like, well, I've got multiple injuries. Which one is the one that's more deadly right now?
Yep.
Which needs to be addressed right now? So that's what kind of makes me initially think that you kind of have to address the issue with black males. But I don't know.
Interestingly enough, my personal feeling is if we help black women,
right,
we help ourselves.
Okay.
The reason I say that, black women, when it comes to black men, they put us first.
Okay.
Oftentimes, black women will not date outside of black men. And when it comes to black issues, black women always seem to be at the forefront of that.
Right.
Again, going back to Black Lives Matter movement being started by black women. But, and this is not an indictment on all black men, so I don't want anybody to take it, because obviously we
somebody will anyway.
two black men right here. But I guess you can pose a question is, the more we help black men, and we definitely should be helping black men, regardless of what I'm about to say, is does that have an impact on what we're doing for black women, and how do we address that? So the more we invest in black men, do black women benefit from that? Because to me, if we're helping black women, I think directly and indirectly, however you look at it, there's going to be a direct addressing of black men as a result of that. But going back to this article, when you talk about feminism, the way the author lays it out, and Psychology Today, you could take that article with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
It's saying that feminism negatively impacts black men, black boys. So I don't know. It's still that balancing thing. And again, I'm not saying that no help should be given to black men. That's absolutely not what I'm saying, because that's absolutely the case. But I'm saying if we're talking about, and somebody puts a gun to my head and says, hey, make a choice on what issue you decide to resolve, or you try to seek solutions for. And I had to absolutely make a choice. My thought process that is, because of this idea that there's so many black men shooting black women down in terms of, I don't date black women, and I don't want to be connected to black women. And that's not to say black women don't do something similar in terms of like a small segment of them, because I'm sure it does happen. But you see it more with black men. So my thought process that, the more we help black women, the more we'll be able to help ourselves. Because they're the ones raising us. They're the ones who are fighting for us. They're the ones who are on the front lines in terms of the movements and trying to do everything possible to uplift black men.
Now, here's my question, and I agree with you to a certain extent. And just as you were saying it, I'm trying to see, like, what would my decision be? And part of me is saying, I agree. But the other part of me is saying, if the numbers have switched, because I believe that at some point, the the attention was paid to men, period, and then eventually black women, then black men, and then lastly black women. But whatever attention was paid, these college numbers suggest that the women are, I don't want to use the word benefiting, but they're taking advantage of the opportunities before them better than black men. For whatever reason or however it translates, that's what the statistics suggest. They're taking better, they're making the most of the opportunities. Now, if our attention is directed toward black women, the question then becomes, is that disparity going to grow even further? And if it grows even further, then what really happens? Because what you're now doing is you're reducing the ability for this black woman to have or build or create a black family, because she's reaching these heights with no prospect of a black husband as his stock. If we're turning our back, and I'm only saying turning our back because if we're talking in this position of having to choose
hypothetical,
one, right? Then that disparity just continues to grow. So then what happens is we kind of get back to this idea of last week's show, where the emasculation aspect is kind of back in play, because you have this woman who is achieving all of these wonderful things, and she's left to choose from men who are not achieving the same way. It doesn't mean that he's a loser. It doesn't mean that he's not educated. He's just not reaching that same level. And that's going to have a very interesting dynamic in the house, right?
Absolutely.
So I just think that it's really hard to kind of look at it and say, damn, what is the what do you fix?
Right.
But then there are going to be people who say, well, damn, we can put our attention into the black man and fix him, and then he's just going to run off anyway.
Right.
So what's the point?
To quote the old Kanye West.
How many Kanyes are there anyway?
The idea exists, and the fear exists that with black men is like, when I get on, I'm gonna leave you for a white girl. So there is a legitimate fear that is the case when you look at successful black men and who we see, whether it be on social media or generally in media, whether it be NFL. Right. I think NBA is a little bit more of a balance in terms of dating black women, but either way, right. From that perspective, you see exactly that when black men get on, right, and when successful black men are out there, at a certain income level, they're dating outside of the race. So, I mean, again, this is a topic that we can continue on with forever, and there's so many conversations that we're gonna have as a result of this. And honestly, I didn't know we were gonna sort of dive so much into this, and I think as a result of this, we'll again have several more episodes, because even with us discussing this, there's a lot to unpack, and you can see the evidence exists that it's virtually impossible to say, hey, we're going to take up one issue and ignore the other, because obviously we don't want to do that. Right. But hypothetically speaking, if we have to make a choice, what is that choice? What is the choice? Yeah. And it's impossible to do that and just be comfortable with whatever decision you make, no matter what side. Right. Because
they create an extreme detriment.
Right.
One way or the other.
Right.
So, man.
I feel like we always do this, but that's how we work.
That's the whole point, right?
Right, exactly. And that's the whole point of this podcast. To
create some thought.
Exactly.
And dialogue.
Exactly. So, I mean, as a result, I think a bunch of questions can follow this episode. Are we doing enough? And generally speaking, to help our cause, whether it be black people, black men, black women, what are some of the steps that we can take as a result of this? And again, we always want to hear feedback from you guys, understand what conversations we need to be having. And moving forward, we plan to have more people on to dive deeper into these conversations. I think in the next few episodes, we want to involve black women's perspective even more to discuss how they feel about these situations or these circumstances, and to understand from their perspective how they sort of grapple with this idea that they're sort of ignored and how they deal with that marginalization that exists for Black women. So there's going to be a lot in the next few episodes, and I definitely say you guys tune in, strap up your seatbelts, continue to comment, continue to be a part of this conversation, and continue to do everything possible to make sure you, even with this podcast, hold us accountable to make sure we're talking about the right things and we're reviewing these conversations and discussions in the way that we need to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when you have when things come across your timeline or whatever, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Shoot us a message.
Yep.
We'll respond. We'll take it into consideration and see if we can build a topic around it. We're always looking for guests. Of course, we're going to pre-screen you, make sure you're not crazy. But we're always looking for guests to come in and speak on different issues as well. So, yeah, feel free to be engaged and interactive.
I'm excited, and I hope you guys are. With that said, this is Sounding Black. I'm Till.
And I'm Will.
Sounding off.